It's an industry that saw 5 billion people transported around the world in the year 2019, employing 11 million people directly with up to 55 million people indirectly. Sounds like those are big numbers. Let's take a look at them one more time, full screen, however. For the year 2019, looking at 11 million people directly that it employs with up to 55 million people indirectly, like in the hospitality industry, things like hotels, restaurants, etc. Well, recent events have caused the industry to come to a sudden standstill, from a string of technical issues to a killer virus, of course.
We have given, a range of estimate of the loss of revenues that will be that will be the result of the coronavirus crisis. It goes from 63 billion US dollars loss of revenues up to 113 billion US dollars loss of revenues.
Quite a range there. Well, one of the world's largest manufacturers of aircraft, namely Boeing, saw its fate in the hands of two incidents that happened, and this was tragic. It was its new 737 MAX series, and they were both due to technical error.
We've made mistakes, and we got some things wrong. We're improving, and we're learning, and we're continuing to learn. We established a permanent aerospace safety committee of our board. We've stood up a new safety organization. We've strengthened our engineering organization so that all engineers now report up through Boeing's chief engineer. We're also helping to rebuild the communities and families impacted by these accidents. We've pledged $100 million to this effort and have hired renowned experts in this area to ensure families can access these funds as quickly as possible. No amount of money can bring back what was lost, but we can at least help the families meet their financial needs.
Hello, welcome to another edition of Economic Divide with me, Kavita Hawai. This week's show, we are looking at the aviation industry and how in just 1 year, companies have gone bust, flights have been canceled, and orders have been postponed. So fasten your seatbelts, put your seats in an upright position, and fold your tray tables away because we are ready for takeoff. Now, prior to the arrival of the COVID-19 virus, the aviation industry was not doing that bad. However, for Boeing, things were not so good. With the two 737 MAX crashes, the company claimed revenues had dropped by $19 billion. The coronavirus has shocked the entire industry to the core, with companies going into liquidation, such as the UK-based Flybe, which saw 2,000 jobs lost, and the British government refusing a £100 million bailout. The International Air Transport Association has stated that airlines will need well in excess of $113 billion in order to survive. However, as the coronavirus continues, these figures could easily rise as companies reduce flights by at least 80% or may cancel altogether. Now, the industry has also taken on a knock-on effect of sorts, with the tourism, hotel, restaurants, and others all affected, losing out on the $1.4 trillion tourism industry, which accounts for 7% of the global GDP.
Very much like Coca-Cola and Pepsi in the soft drink sector, Airbus and Boeing totally dominate the aircraft manufacturers market, with a whopping 99% market share of the wide-body aircraft supply chain, from the majestic Airbus A380 to the workhorse Boeing 777. When the figures are then calculated for the entire aviation industry, bringing in the likes of regional aircraft, including the A320 and the Boeing 737, the duopoly account for around 90% of the market, dwarfing all other manufacturers and leaving very little room for others, although the Chinese have attempted to introduce the Comac, albeit in vain, as things stand today. Based in Toulouse in France, Airbus is Europe's largest aircraft manufacturer, with annual revenues in the region of $64 billion per year. The company is home to the world's largest passenger aircraft, the glorious A380, which can see in excess of 500 passengers on board. Yet with pressure mounting by environmentalists on the carbon footprint of aircraft, Airbus have announced that they're going to go to cleaner and greener aircraft, and have hence retired production of the majestic A380 in favour of the more efficient A350, which saw Qatar Airways as a launch customer for this type. The competition in terms of building more eco-friendly aircraft is also a challenge that has been accepted by Airbus's main rival, the American Boeing company. With headquarters based in Chicago, Illinois, and its main factory in Washington State, Boeing is the world's largest aviation manufacturing company, with an annual revenue in excess of $100 billion, and employing over 153,000 people. Boeing, as with Airbus, is also on the path to finding a more efficient aircraft, with the 787 Dreamliner equivalent to the Airbus A350 in terms of performance and environmental impact. Lately, however, Boeing has come under huge scrutiny from the loss of 2 passenger aircraft in 1 year, namely the ill-fated Boeing 737 MAX, which saw the fatal crashes bring Boeing into huge reputational and financial trouble.
On behalf of myself and the Boeing Company, we are sorry, deeply and truly sorry.
Needless to say, the events that led to the disaster saw Muhlenberg fired as CEO and became the catalyst of further woes that would strike the entire industry in January 2020.
The airline industry is without a doubt one of the most globally prestigious and lucrative, with countries priding themselves on their airlines, offering longer routes, more connections and better service than ever. In 2019 alone, over 5 billion passengers were whisked through the air, reaching destinations across the 4 corners of the earth. Now, the industry itself directly employs, believe it or not, over 11 million people and a further 55 million people. Now, that's more than the entire population of Korea. Since the year 2003, the industry has seen revenues jump from $322 billion per year up to $872 billion per year. However, this will no doubt be different for the year 2020, the current year that we're in. The 2 largest manufacturers, Boeing and Airbus, dominate the global airline market, with Boeing seeing figures of around $101 billion a year income, and Airbus, well, they are earning around $63.7 billion per year. Yet, with the 737 MAX crash and the virus again, 2020 is going to be a very different picture.
The arrival of the coronavirus, named COVID-19, not only brought with it death and illness to those who were unlucky enough to catch the disease, but also brought with it the biggest financial crash since the 2008 bubble burst, and as time goes on, is looking ever more like the Great Depression of the 1920s, with stock markets crashing and the world falling into pure chaos. One of the hardest hit industries of them all is no doubt the aviation industry. With around 5 billion people flying last year, the current crisis has seen air travel drop as much as 85% in some places, leaving airlines crippled, desperate for an outcome, and unfortunately for some, bankrupt. Many airlines are now seeking government bailouts in the hundreds of millions of dollars, with figures suggesting over $200 billion is needed overall.
We have seen and will continue to see the virus have an impact on world GDP growth. It will and has had an impact on traffic, and we're going to see the bottom lines of our customers impacted.
Companies such as Korean Airlines have notified shareholders that the impact of the virus has left the company fighting for survival, and they've been joined by the likes of Virgin Atlantic in the UK, who have asked for a multi-million-pound bailout, as well as Norwegian, Air France KLM, and American Airlines, all registering the fact that they're in trouble too. The loss of business and route cuts have also seen many flight crew and cabin crew asked to take unpaid leave, meaning that livelihoods are at risk, even for the fittest and wealthiest airlines.
As of today, nearly 2,400 of my cabin crew are not flying because of restriction that they cannot go to the places.
Furthermore, with routes cancelled and reduced, many people are stuck in foreign lands, with France and the UK still seeing around 30,000 nationals in various locations unable to get home. With multiple nations across the globe pledging trillions of dollars in order to save economies from the impact of the coronavirus, one has to therefore legitimately raise the question as to where on the priority list the aviation industry lies when it comes to potentially fixing one of history's most devastating periods to mankind, both in terms of health and the economy.
Mahan Abedin joins us now, our current affairs and impact analyst, to tell us more about a new capacity that you're in now in terms of what you're going to be telling us. If you can explain that a little bit before you get on with it.
Yes, so we're just going to be reviewing a series of tweets from people commenting on important issues of the day. So I'll introduce the tweets and
Great.
we could
What's your
have
first
say.
tweet?
Well, you know, the airline industry is going through a very tough patch at the moment. A lot of the flights are grounded, up to 90% of flights being grounded. And one of the big issues of the day is that should they get a bailout in the same way that banks got a bailout over 10 years ago in the economic crash. Also, the car makers got a bailout. So should the airlines get a bailout because of the coronavirus?
There was a lot of
problem?
pushback on them getting a bailout. Why is that?
Well, for instance, in the UK, Richard Branson, this really rich tycoon, Virgin Atlantic, he wanted a bailout, and people said, hang on a minute, hang on. These are very rich companies. Richard Branson and all the bosses, they're getting paid handsome dividends and salaries. Shouldn't some of that money go towards better upkeep of it? So there was pushback because of that. But I think the consensus is, if you go beyond general public opinion, look at the expert opinion, the general consensus appears to be that these airlines, just like the banks 10 years ago, just like the car makers 10 years ago, they're just too big to fail.
Okay, my question to you now is going to be, first, you had the 2008 financial crisis, you had the airlines suffer.
Yes.
From then on, when they got all this, I don't want to call free money, then they start doing what's called buybacks. And that is why it seems like everybody unsympathetic towards them. That they've done the buybacks and now they have to be bailed out, and they're saying, no, that shouldn't happen. What is this buyback about?
Well, it's the money that's already gone into it from the government. I think this is the feeling that some of the subsidies that have gone into the airlines, that the money hasn't been managed properly. But I think in this scenario, you have to make a differentiation as well. Like British Airways, for instance, is a national institution. So it's not going to be allowed to fail.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. Mahan
welcome.
Abedin, our current affairs and impact analyst. It's great to have you with us, Mahan. Remember, folks, check out our very own Twitter page and leave us your thoughts by visiting us on @ED_program. We'd love to hear from you. Time for a quick break. Coming up, don't go away. We're going to be telling you about how the aviation industry has been stretched beyond airports and beyond planes, and it plays a part in so many other trades also. Look, we're going to have also at the aviation industry being used by some states as a political tool, with both sanctions and blockades playing a major role in how certain countries and airlines are operating. We're also very lucky to be joined by Daniel Gaz, also known as Nonstop Dan, a world-famous traveler and YouTube figure who delivers excellent and honest reviews of global airlines for his view on the aviation industry. So take a few moments to grab something from the drinks trolley. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Economic Divide with me, Kaveh Tahweh, where this week we're soaring above the clouds with the aviation industry. Now, it gives me great pleasure to say that joining me on the show today is Daniel Gaz, also known as Nonstop Dan on YouTube. A seasoned traveler, Dan travels the world reviewing airlines and provides his followers on the channel with an honest review of each journey, as well as providing useful traveler hints and tips. Dan, thanks for joining me on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you. Well, Dan, my first question to you is, it goes without saying that the global aviation and airline industry has been thumped hard by the coronavirus outbreak. What is your take on the issue, and how have airlines dealt with what's going on?
So the impact on the aviation industry is obviously huge. We have never really seen anything happen like this before, and it's pretty crazy how fast things are changing. Because just a few weeks ago, I was flying Singapore Airlines, and I was talking to the crew about the situation, whether they were worried, what the airline was doing, and they said that we feel pretty confident about this. We managed SARS pretty well, so they felt like they kind of practiced and they knew what was coming. But just a few days later, the airline revealed massive cuts to their routes, and I think this is something we're seeing all across the industry, and airlines are not prepared for this. They had no idea the scale that this would reach, and we still don't really know how big the scale will be and how long it will last.
Well, the airline industry is a very competitive industry. Obviously, we've got some big companies with multiple routes. So how important is customer service for passengers in the modern era air travel?
I think that people like to think that customer service is very important to them, and some airlines make their customer service a big marketing point. We have Singapore Airlines, which is known around the world for their famous Singapore girls and how amazing their service is supposed to be. But I think in the end, especially in Europe and the US, travel has changed so much, and because of low-cost carriers and because of more fuel-efficient planes, people can fly, across the country for almost nothing, which means in the end, people have to sacrifice something to pay these low prices. And that's the reason that Ryanair, EasyJet, and AirAsia, for example, are so successful, because people would much rather get to their destination cheaply, I think, than having an amazing experience on board, especially if they're flying in economy class.
So money is an important factor here, Dan, from what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay, final question then, Dan. Skytrax releases a yearly award system for airlines. How important are these awards, do you think, and does it actually motivate the airlines to do better?
So, the Skytrax Awards are the biggest awards in aviation, but I definitely wouldn't compare them to the Oscars in terms of legitimacy and maybe how the airlines are ranked. That said, I think that the airlines like Skytrax as a marketing tool, because especially for an airline like Qatar Airways, which is currently being blockaded by its neighboring countries, it's a very nice accolade for them to be able to say that they're the best airline in the Middle East or the best airline in the world. So in that sense, the Skytrax Awards are really nice for the airline, since they become kind of political, and the awards are a good marketing tool.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Daniel Gauss there, all the way from Sweden. It was a pleasure to have you on Economic Divide.
Thanks again for having me.
Sure. Okay, so much for Dan. If you would like to see more from him, make sure you follow him on his YouTube channel, details of which are on your screens now. Well, stay with us. Coming right up, we'll take a look at how the airline industry plays a big part in multiple other trades and examine how their economic relations are intertwined.
There's an obvious knock-on effect of the collapse of the aviation industry. As we've mentioned, the staff that are directly involved in the sector are currently undergoing tough times as uncertainty remains over their future within the airlines. With over 11 million people directly employed in the airline industry and a further 55 million holding secondary roles, the scale of the crisis becomes clear when hotels, shops, tourist spots and restaurants all rely on aviation to bring in the footfall they require, be this from seasoned business travellers to families booking a package holiday. The impact is clear for all to see.
Our income comes mostly from the tourists, almost 100% from the tourists, especially now over in Pattaya, they are the Chinese. The Chinese are, I would say, 80% of the tourists are Chinese in Pattaya.
Furthermore comes the impact of the logistics industry, with companies like DHL, FedEx and airline cargoes all relying on the skies to import and export goods around the world. Not only are the airlines not carrying the goods, meaning an impact on the jobs, but also essential supplies across the globe are being disrupted due to the knock-on effect of the virus. The impact on the hotel industry is also an important factor, with many hotels simply remaining empty, leaving many of the workers who are on a minimum wage left out of pocket. In some nations, governments have stepped up to pay around 80% of the wages of staff. Yet, in most nations, where tourism is a key provider of salaries, the fact that many are developing nations means that there is no government support. The fate of hotels is now left in the hands of how the virus transcends before summer, and with many people still uncertain as to whether the holiday season will actually kick off this year, hoteliers are left struggling to decide as to what to do to prepare for the worst.
It means that we have got to reorganize ourselves. We've got to relook at what to do. We've got to see how to safeguard our staff and our property. It is not good.
There are of course a whole host of other trades and industries that rely hugely on the aviation sector, be it restaurants, tourism and even the spare part industry for the airplanes themselves. Yet the future remains very turbulent for all, as the impact of the virus takes its toll on everything it comes into contact with.
Now, so far throughout this program, we've studied how various factors have impacted the aviation industry. But what about the impact that the aviation industry has on affairs, in particular, the environment? Emissions are the most obvious topic that comes to mind when thinking about the subject, with CO2 figures from aviation accounting for around 1.5% to 2% of the total global carbon dioxide figures. However, this figure only equates to a global average, with less developed nations having lower figures. Some of the more frequent flying nations actually see aviation contributing to around 6.3 to 8% of the CO2 emissions. Yet aside from the impact of the aviation industry on the environment, the industry also has a huge impact on the economy. The UK has long debated the notion of a third runway at Heathrow Airport. The UK government insists the expansion will lead to an increased revenue of £10 billion per year to the UK. Claims also state that passengers will get cheaper flights due to competition, and the expansion will create up to 77,000 jobs, which, let's face it, in tough times is a blessing to some. Now, before we go, let's take a look at how the aviation industry can be used as a political tool.
The aviation industry, being dominated by the likes of Boeing and Airbus, means that there's room for the sector to become politicized. When Iran signed a JCPOA in 2015, the immediate intention was to renew the severely aging airline fleet that was still flying in Iran, with some aircraft having over 30 years flight time in their logbooks. The JCPOA saw Iran strike multi-billion-dollar deals with both Airbus and Boeing, as well as ATR, and would have potentially seen over 200 new aircraft hitting the skies of Iran and abroad under the Iranian flag. Initially, all went well, with Airbus delivering 2 zero-hour A330s from Toulouse, as well as a brand new A321, all under the colours of the national airline, Iran Air. However, the arrival of Donald Trump saw the abrupt end to the multi-million-dollar deal that would have seen Iran with one of the newest fleets in the world.
ابتدا باید توجه کنیم که این اقدامات خزانه‌داری آمریکا در تناقض کامل با تعهدات کشور آمریکا در برابر کنوانسیون بین‌المللی هواپیمایی کشوری هست. جایی که در مقدمه اون به صراحت ذکر شده که هدف از هواپیمایی کشوری ایجاد دوستی و تفاهم بین ملت هاست و هر گونه سوء استفاده از اون میتونه امنیت جهانی رو به خطر بیاندازد.
The impact of Trump's decision was clearly political, as not only would it have created billions of dollars for both Airbus and Boeing, but it would have benefited the Iranian people using the newer and evidently safer fleet. Therefore, one should question as to why Trump tore up the agreement. The US is not the only nation in the world acting tough on aviation when it comes to sanctions. The Saudi regime, along with Egypt, Bahrain and the UAE, as well as a host of other nations, placed a so-called diplomatic blockade on the state of Qatar, which essentially saw a multitude of sanctions placed on the gas-rich state, and more importantly, saw Qatar unable to use certain airspace, making flights to and from Doha longer than they should have been.
Now coming to the favorite subject of the blockade. What was achieved by our adversaries in this blockade? Zero. They failed in intimidating my country, putting us against the wall, trying to take over our sovereignty, trying to dictate our foreign policy, trying to dictate who our friends should be. In every single aspect, they failed.
The impact of the blockade also made flights less efficient, saw a larger carbon footprint made due to the longer flights and more fuel usage, and of course saw Qatar lose several routes due to the sanctions.
The aviation industry faces a long, hard slug ahead with the impact of the coronavirus and the difficult situation in which Boeing finds itself. With jobs lost, airlines closed, and sanctions and blockades in place, the future is looking very bleak for the glamorous industry. Whether or not it bounces back, well, that will be a question that only time can answer. So it's time to wish you all farewell for this episode. If you have any issues you want to discuss with us in a future show, be sure to follow us on Twitter using @AD_program and leave us a comment. Our details are on your screens now. Our Twitter page is full of interesting facts and figures and raises the questions that others are afraid to ask. So do check it out. I've been your host, Kaveh, and on behalf of myself and the whole team here on the show, thanks for watching. I'll see you again soon.